Hello, I'm Steve Hammond from the Massachusetts Association of Regional Schools, MARS. As part of our professional development program, we are producing video clips that will present different aspects about the operation of a regional school district from the viewpoint of school committee members, superintendents, business administrators, and staff. This program is entitled Budget Development. For this program, we have Stacy Jackson and Julie Kelly. Both of these are former members of the Wachusett Regional School District School Committee. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Stacy Jackson and Julie Kelly.
Thank you, Steve. First slide, please. What we're going to talk about today is budget development and when and how to start, and we're going to go through the timeline. So the timeline that we're going to present is typically the timeline that would be followed for a May or June town meeting, annual town meeting. If your town or district's town meeting is at a different time, you might have a slightly different timeline, but ours is for a spring town meeting. So the budget process usually begins with the release of the raw MCAS information at the end of June. And the raw MCAS scores really give administration a lot of information about areas that you might need to focus on in the following year, or it shows areas that you've had a lot of success and you can see the benefit of maintaining the programs in that particular area. Also, the administration needs to look at the district's strategic plan, and that will help to focus budget priorities as well. Next slide, please. In the fall months between September and December, the superintendent has a number of different things to look at. The needs of each school, by working with the school principals, need to be assessed. Each school in your district is going to have different needs, both for staffing and programmatic needs, and the school principal can raise those concerns with the superintendent to include in the following year's budget. The staff really needs to be looked at because typically staff is one of your biggest areas on your budget. So you need to look at the number of retirements that's expected and any staff lane and step increases, and then potentially any additional staffing needs, or if there's areas where your enrollment is declining, you might be able to cut staff in certain areas as well. You need to look at any maintenance needs and anticipated utility cost increase. So utility costs are typically kind of hard to predict, but if you do have increases that you are aware of, those can be built into the budget very early on. The SIMS update, that information will determine your enrollment. So that shows which areas, which particular grades or particular schools are growing or decreasing. And that's going to affect not only class size, but your transportation needs. One area here that's really important for administration to look at is the town census data. So you can get that information from your town clerk, and parents typically fill out the town census data and hopefully include their students on there. Not all parents put their students on there, but a district could remind parents when the census data comes out that it's really important to put all the children on there so that the district can plan accordingly. This is very, very helpful in anticipating how many kindergarten students you have coming in. So again, typically it will be a little underreported in terms of the amount of students that you are expecting, but it gives the district a good ballpark of what to anticipate in terms of the number of kindergarten students. And then also special education needs to be looked at very carefully. For your out-of-district tuitions, you typically have a ballpark idea of how much the tuition is going to increase year to year. And then you also have to look at how many students are aging out, how many students are coming on, and any program needs that can be addressed through in-district programs as well. Go to the next slide, please. In the January timeframe, the superintendent should be meeting with the HR director and the business manager. And really the focus of those meetings are to look at all of the different insurance policies of the district. Your medical insurance is one of your biggest costs to the district, and in recent years we've seen those costs skyrocket. Those premiums keep going up and up. So you really need to work closely with your district insurance broker to look at different plans, different policies to try to minimize those cost increases. And of course, that's for districts that have private health insurance other than GIC. You also need to look at other insurance policies that you have, liability and loss policies, workers' compensation policies, and any anticipations that you have with unemployment insurance. And you can put out a request for proposal to change those plans if that's appropriate. January timeframe, the superintendent should also be meeting with the school committee to look at different budget priorities. Each year you have different members sitting at the school committee table, and a lot of times there could be different budget priorities based on what they hear from their constituents and what's going on in the district at the time. So you really need to be cognizant of where everyone's priorities are and try to meet those priorities the best you can. Next slide, please. Then on the last Wednesday in January, the governor releases his state budget, and this is hotly anticipated. Everyone's waiting for that because that's when everything really begins in terms of DESE calculating the foundation budget, the foundation aid, and the minimum local contribution for each district and member town. And the MLC may increase for towns that are under target, but unfortunately that does not often translate to more funding for the district to spend. It just means that that's more money that's coming out of your local member town, which can pose problems for member towns. Before we talk about that in detail, just one thing to note is this is typically where the MLC comes out and does not change. What we've seen in recent years is numbers have changed over the course of all the different budget iterations, but the school committee really needs to go with this minimum local contribution and plan accordingly, because if the numbers from the state change significantly, especially if they go down, that wreaks havoc in the budgeting process for the district.
I would add that the Regional School Association of Mars urges the legislature not to change the MLC numbers as we go down through the budget process. It's just as Stacy said, it can cause a whole lot of problems to them. However, sometimes they have, but again, generally we try to stay with that MLC. The state budget isn't passed, and later we'll tell you, but not until June. But meanwhile, you have to go back to town meetings in May and June. So these are the best numbers you go with, and we really urge them not to make any major changes. Next slide.
So with the minimum local contribution, school committee members really need to be understanding and cognizant of the impact of the MLC on the town's ability to pay. So looking at an example here, this is from the town of Spencer, and you can see with the first highlighted column there, the MLC increase as a percentage. So you can see that those MLC increases have been very substantial for the town of Spencer. That in itself poses a significant problem because this is just MLC, which is only one part of educational assessment. The other assessments that the town has is a potential operations assessment, which is over and above the foundation, which most districts need to use to operate. They also have a transportation assessment and a debt assessment. So again, MLC is just one portion of that. So if MLC alone is increasing upwards of 4, 5, 6%, that's very significant. But even more significant and a very important area for school committee members to understand is how MLC is taking up the new revenue from the town. So this is new money coming into the town that is available to education. However, you should not be taking up all of it just for education. Typically, in most districts and towns, about 50% of a town's budget goes to educational assessments. And again, these are all the different assessments, not only MLC. So when MLC alone takes up more than 30%, takes up 50 or 100% of the new revenue, that puts the town services into an area that really need to be cut substantially just to allow the town to pay their MLC assessment. So what's really important is for the school committee members and the superintendents to understand how the MLC is impacting their town, because it really changes the discussion around the table to the town doesn't want to pay to an understanding of the town simply cannot pay because they don't have the financial resources because of the MLC issue. So that's a significant problem that affects probably upwards of about 50% of the towns in the Commonwealth. So that's an area that people really need to be cognizant of. Next slide, please. In the January to March timeframe, the superintendent should be starting to present the budget recommendations to the school committee and meet with the town officials from each town to review those budget recommendations. It's very important to get preliminary information to the towns as early as possible because that's very important for them to be able to build their municipal budgets and have an understanding of where the school budget will likely come. With different budgets, people talk about level funded, level service, or zero based. So a level funded budget means that the budget is the same as the previous year. There are no increases. However, what happens with that is it's in essence a cut because there are certain areas that there are fixed costs. We know that contracts increase every year. We know utility costs go up every year. So to truly level fund a budget means you have to take cuts to other areas to account for those fixed cost increases. A lot of times a budget might be labeled as level service, and what this means is that there's no new services, staff, or programs added, and the budget will likely still increase, again, because of those fixed costs and contract increases that you have. And a zero-based budget is where you essentially start from scratch and build your budget up. There are some towns and regions that do this. It's especially important and very useful for new superintendents who are trying to get a handle on the budget if there's certain areas of concern. There are a lot of other towns and districts that will look at last year's budget and add increases or decreases to that. So it's a different way to approach the budget process. Next slide, please. In the February timeframe, the superintendent and the school committee should hold a budget hearing where the budget presentation is given and the opportunity for the public to speak to the committee on the budget concerns. Now, some districts and some towns have like a preliminary budget that the school committee will kind of vote for or give a nod for, and that's the budget that is presented at the budget hearing. And in others, the superintendent, based on feedback from prior meetings with the school committee, will present that initial budget. So different districts and towns do it different ways. And at some of these budget hearings, you might see members from the towns come out and express, any financial concerns that they may have, or any budget priorities that they hear from the members of the towns, different areas that should be focused on. And that's all information that the school committee and the administration can use going forward as you proceed through this budget process. The budget presentation made to the committee and the public must adhere to the requirements of 603 CMR 4105, which Julie's going to go into detail about.
Next slide, please. So the regional school committee shall propose, and this is your preliminary budget, by majority vote, a budget containing all proposed operating expenditures, capital expenditures, and debt service payments to be paid from the general revenue of the regional school district. And the budget shall be classified into line items, and you usually want to stick to your 9 line items, but some districts give very detailed information to the public. It's completely up to the comfort level of the school committee and the superintendent to answer questions about that level of detail. The budget shall also identify each separate revenue source and the amount estimated for the revenue source, and shall specify whether a member's assessment are to be calculated pursuant to statutory assessment method or the alternative assessment method, and shall specify the total amounts to be assessed to the members for the support of the budget. We're going to give a presentation on the statutory assessment method versus an alternative assessment method and the challenges of both in the future. Next slide, please. The regional school committee may include a line item in the budget for reserve and extraordinary and unanticipated expenditures, and they may also include a line item in the budget for transfers into a stabilization fund, which I'm going to let Steve talk about.
Chapter 71, 16G and a half allows regional school districts to establish a stabilization account. This is a process you have to follow through, and your member towns have to give you authorization to develop it, to establish it. Once you have it, then you can put a line item in your budget for X number of dollars, and then on July 1, after your budget's approved, it is transferred into the stabilization account. And the funds in the stabilization account can only be used for what you could borrow or capital projects. We encourage districts to establish the stabilization account. And practically, if you look ahead 4 or 5 years out, you're going to replace a boiler for $400,000 or $500,000. You could put $100,000 away each year, and then when it's time to replace it, you have the money. Also, if you're ever going to do any long-term borrowing and issuing bonds, the rating agencies look favorably when you have stabilization accounts and other accounts that show that the district is very stable. Next slide, please.
Expenditures from grants, revolving accounts, trust funds, and other funds may be expended by the regional school committee without further appropriation. And what that means is that you do not require a town meeting vote to approve expenditures from those accounts. However, the school committee does approve all expenditures from those accounts. sometimes the superintendent will provide information about athletic accounts in cafeteria especially, or kindergarten tuition revolving accounts, just to show how much money is coming in there and being expended from there, and how much is being subsidized by the general budget, just for information purposes for the school committee and for the public. The regional school committee shall hold a public hearing on the proposed budget. And a public hearing means you're opening the floor to the public to speak on that budget. And following such a hearing, shall adopt the budget by a 2/3 vote, incorporating those changes from the proposed budget as the regional school committee deems appropriate. And then after the school committee has approved that budget, the treasurer of the school committee certifies it and sends assessment letters within 30 days to your member towns. The school committee must adopt a budget 45 days before the first annual member town meeting, but not later than March 1st and not earlier than February 1st.
Next slide, please.
With the approval of the majority of the member communities, the superintendent shall submit the budget following the notification of the annual local aid distribution. So your superintendent wants to make sure every year when their town meetings are going to be held, most of them are included in bylaw language of each member town, but they want to make sure your business manager and superintendent is on top of when those dates are. Next slide, please. So the fund begins after the governor releases his budget. It gets sent into the House Ways and Means Committee, and they start working furiously on their budget. And that usually comes out on a Wednesday, and it's usually in April. I would say like the week before April vacation. That comes out on a Wednesday by noon, and then the members of the House representative have until Friday at 5 p.m. to file their amendments. The House then holds formal sessions to debate the budget and amendments, which can span several days. It's important to note, as we stated before, that while the House numbers for foundation and local aid may change when their budget is released, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education will not adjust their calculations to MLC and aid until a final budget is signed by the governor. And there can be problems with that, but Mars has addressed that. We haven't seen that in several years. And typically by the second Wednesday, next slide please, in May, the Senate Ways and Means Committee releases their budget, and then they follow the same process of the House. So the Senate debates it. It takes several days. A final budget is voted on, and once the Senate has voted on their budget, it goes into something that's called a conference committee, because you're going to have differences between your House and Senate budgets.
If we could have the next slide, please.
And the conference committee is appointed. It's usually the chair and the vice chair
Ways and Means.
House Ways and Means, the Senate Ways and Means, and then 2 Republican members. And they reconcile the differences, and they come up with a final budget. That goes to the House and the Senate. No amendments are allowed to be voted or amended, or the budget's not allowed to be amended at all. It's an up and down vote. Once that's done, it goes to the governor, and he has 10 days to approve or veto those line items in the budget. While you won't get any changes on Chapter 70 from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, can we have the next slide, please? You will get a cherry sheet from the Department of Revenue. And as you can see, they release anticipated aid based on those budgets after each one is released, which is helpful information for you to develop your budget. Next slide, please. In May timeframe, April, May, June, you have your town meetings. The appropriating authority for all expenditures for the town services and for the school budget is the town meeting. And your budget is presented to town meeting attendees, and they vote it up and down. In a regional school district, approval of a budget is contingent on the approval of 2/3 of your member towns.
I would add, if you're a 2-member district, you have 2-town district, you have to have both. You get a 3, you got to have 2 out of the 3. 4, you got to get 3 out of the 4. So you have to take 2/3 of your member towns in order to have a budget that is then they're certified and then has been passed. So one of the things that we will be talking about in future things is if your budget doesn't pass, and so we'll provide more information on that. So I want to say thank you for your attention, and this ends our video clip today on budget development.